Next, we're going to hear from Charlene Barshefsky about trade, national security, and bilateral regional trade agreements in Asia. For almost 10 years, as you know, countries in Asia previously committed solely to the multilateral trade liberalization process have been feverishly negotiating bilateral and regional trade partnerships, sometimes with significant exclusions of trade sectors. And since China joined the WTO, which of course Charlene thoughtfully and brilliantly negotiated, the pace has quickened. So we're delighted that she's prepared to discuss with us today this congeries of issues: trade, national security, and regional partnerships. And she'll talk about the trade agenda in the next administration in the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherman. It's a great pleasure to be here. And Fred, thank you for providing the digs. Very, very nice. So this issue of trade and security is a very big topic, and all I can really do is skim the surface in the most superficial way. I think we can all agree that American strategic and foreign policy interests are tightly intertwined with our economic interests. Our international heft stems in large part from our economic dominance. Our economic relationships, in turn, are a key pillar in our strategic alliances around the world. Most obvious example in the case of China, the ballast of the U.S.-China relationship is trade and investment. But if you look at the congressional vote on permanent normal trade relations with China, it was as much a foreign policy and security vote as it was a vote with respect to economic benefit. That trade and larger strategic and foreign policy interests are meshed and are mutually reinforcing has been clear for generations, far in advance of globalization and the technological revolution that has largely spawned it, well in advance of the shrinking or flattening of the world. As most of you know, most Americans would view today's WTO as the embodiment of globalization, but the embodiment was actually the GATT system established in 1947 post-war, that is to say, the forerunner agreement to the WTO. In the early 1920s, each of the leaders of World War II grew up in a period of increasing economic isolationism and increasing fear of trade with poor countries. You literally saw the disintegration of what had previously been a relatively integrated world, with the result embodied by Hoover's famous views that the U.S. couldn't compete with low-wage countries without lowering our standard of living. You had the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, and that Tariff Act, driven by powerful emotion, supplemented by Europe's colonial preference scheme, raced around the world under the pressure of financial crisis, and in a 3-year period leading up to the Great Depression, cut world trade by 70%. The result lengthened and deepened the Depression. It contributed to virulent nationalism, political animosity, and ultimately war. Reflecting on that experience, Roosevelt, Truman, the leaders of wartime alliances and post-war, thought if you could reduce trade barriers, you would do two things. You would increase prosperity globally, and at that time, even more importantly, you would cement a fragile peace because countries would have an interest in the stability of their neighbors with whom they trade. Those dual functions of trade, prosperity and peace, and they are inseparable, has animated U.S. trade policy in every administration, Democrat and Republican, since 1947. It has animated every European administration since 1947, and it has in turn animated the global system that has been created. So if you look at the creation of the GATT in 1947 and the near simultaneous creation of the IMF and the World Bank on the economic side, and you look at then the near simultaneous creation of NATO and the United Nations, this was an internationalist package designed to operate as a package inextricably linking trade, prosperity, a lowering of trade barriers with enhanced security and peace throughout the world. The vision has provided extraordinary results. So if you look at the last 50 years, our real per capita GDP has gone from $12,000 to $38,000 as industrialized countries cut tariffs from 40% to roughly an average today of 4%. And the security and foreign policy gains for the U.S. have been equally impressive, so that open market and liberal economic policies stood as a beacon to countries behind the Iron Curtain, helped bring about the end of the Cold War. Deng Xiaoping in China in the late 1970s saw the Western liberal economic model and thought that integration with a global community probably made sense from an economic point of view, and ultimately, as China is emerging from isolation, from a security point of view for China. So you have this global system that grew from 23 members in 1947, one of which was China, by the way, as a founding member, to 152 members, 4.5 billion people, and rules modeled largely on a combination of U.S. and European leadership. At the same time as that global system has formed, of course, you have this panoply of individual agreements, plurilateral, bilateral, so on and so forth, each having at its core not only presumed economic benefit, as demonstrated by the multilateral system, but also having as its core foreign policy. So if you look at developed countries, for example, developed countries have seen an enduring appeal in post-war logic of trade as a political and security instrument. Two examples: the formation of the EU, right, started as a European coal and steel community, in part to curb the fear of an overly ambitious Germany in the purchase of steel and coal and therefore armaments. Another easy example, Mercosur. Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay. The Mercosur agreement is an agreement that is as much a foreign policy-based agreement as it is an economic agreement. If you look at the U.S., the Caribbean Basin Initiative during the 1980s was intended to complement efforts to end civil war in El Salvador and in Nicaragua. Free trade agreements with Israel, this wasn't an economic agreement, this was a political and foreign policy agreement. Israel isolated in the Middle East by boycott. If you look at the Andean Trade Preference Act, the idea was to give the Andean countries an alternative to drug production, but also to stabilize unstable political regimes at the time. If you look at trade agreements with Bahrain, with Morocco, these were foreign policy thank you agreements with respect to their participation in the Iraq War, as much as it was to encourage continued reform in the Middle East. If you look at the Korea Agreement, which Wendy so brilliantly negotiated, it is as much an agreement designed to begin to reestablish a U.S. presence in Asia as it is an economic agreement. If you look, on the other hand, at developing countries, they also recognize that economic integration not only fuels growth, but presents important opportunities for strategic alliance building, as well as a tool to force internal reform. Examples abound: Southeast Asia, South America, Central Europe, the former Soviet republics, China. Every one of these countries or regions see trade policy as a means not only to speed development, but as a means of enhancing their political bona fides and their security positioning with respect to the neighbors with which they trade. This nexus of trade and foreign policy interests has long been central to the great questions of global politics and global security. The GATT system was in part the way Germany and Japan were reintegrated into the world system in 1947 following the war. It is the system which opened up to countries emerging from European colonial rule in the 1960s and 1970s. It is the system through the 80s and 90s that assisted countries breaking from communist central planning to reform their economies and thereby become imbued with notions of contract, rule of law. It is the system that has created in large part a kind of economic interdependence which above all else in this very turbulent time, is plainly an enhancement to peace. Today you see the maturation of the vision set out by the post-war leaders, this duality of prosperity and of peace, but there are new challenges that emerge, particularly for the United States. Europe now has a population and output in excess of the United States and strong alliances with a web of perhaps 25 or 28 other countries. Asia is forming an economic bloc, 20% of global output, well over $2 trillion in foreign reserves. But for the U.S., as for these countries, security remains intertwined with economic clout and with diplomatic heft. Our military status may be unilateralist. We can, in theory, do whatever we want unilaterally militarily, but our economic status is entirely dependent, and our strategic positioning is entirely dependent as well. So given this underlying framework that I've talked about, and the challenges of not just a new economy today, with the rise of Europe, the reemergence of China, the integration of Asia around China, and at some point India as well, with notions of shared power in the world, we're not the only boy in town. Let me suggest 6 initiatives for the next administration. First, an aggressive focus on Asia. The U.S. faces its most powerful competitive challenge across the Pacific, including questions about great power relationships and security. Over the course of 10 years, Asia has accomplished in economic integration terms what took Europe 60 years to accomplish. Broad and intensified engagement with Asia is absolutely critical and must be informed by China's growth, its central role in Asian integration, and Asia's larger role in the world economy. U.S. re-engagement in the Pacific is the only way, I believe, to adequately balance the alliance structure in Asia and restore a balance that actually is now lacking in Asia. That means, among other things, on the trade side, a greatly intensified push by the U.S. for comprehensive trade agreements in Asia. Second, the next administration needs to dampen Latin American drift. We face the risk of economic uncertainty, political upheaval, and polarization of relationships with Latin America. This is our neighborhood. This is where the United States lives as a geographic matter, and we cannot afford an unstable or unsympathetic series of relationships with Latin America. Since the late 1990s, South America has been affected by recessions punctuated by 2 financial crises. Colombia remains at war. Venezuela has lapsed into authoritarian populism. Ecuador and Bolivia have followed closely behind. As the U.S. drifts, U.S. claims to leadership, including economic leadership in this hemisphere, I believe is at risk. Again, on the trade side, what does that strategic alliance building look like? It looks like a reinvigoration either of the free trade area of the Americas, a notion of common unity, or the weaving together of the existing disparate string of free trade agreements, hopefully to be added to by Colombia, a weaving together of those agreements to create a basis for this notion of a common united structure. Third, strengthen engagement with Europe. The U.S.-European alliance, whether the U.S. and Europe like it or not, is critical to each other's foreign policy and security aims and critical to global security. We need to deepen that European relationship. I've long thought a free trade agreement in services with Europe would make a lot of sense. We can talk about it later, but at a minimum, there has to be enhanced trade relations there. The world should not be divided among either Europe or the U.S. It ought to be Europe and the United States. Fourth, support for Middle East peace. I think the United States has to assist, and Carla alluded to this, in addressing the single greatest failure of the global system, and that is the marginalization of the Muslim world. If you look at the 35 countries, majority Muslim countries, so you're talking from Morocco through the Middle East to Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Central Asia, you are looking at the following. In 1980, these 35 countries had 370 million people. Today they have 700 million people. In 1980, these countries accounted for 13.5% of global exports. Today it's 4.5%. In 1980, these countries accounted for 5% of investment flows. Today it is, in 2000, it is 1.5% of global investment flows. Only 17 of these 35 nations are in the WTO. Only 10 members of the Arab League, 22 members are in the WTO. These countries retain on average the highest trade barriers in the world. They trade less with one another than even the poorest countries in Africa. They have rapidly growing populations. They have contracting economies, a drastically contracting share of the global economy, the highest unemployment rate in the world, and the most political violence and tension anywhere in the world, with the obvious strategic outflows for the United States and others. Economics aren't the cause of this region's ills. Obviously, this has its root in pre-existing religious, political, and ethnic tensions. But the effect of economic dysfunction in these countries raises the social temperature, creates pools of unemployed and angry young men in particular, and makes the task of peacemakers and reformers much harder, and for jihadists much easier. Of course, most recently, parts of the Middle East have experienced an oil boom, huge inflow of wealth into the Persian Gulf. But this money doesn't tend to create jobs. It causes inflation. It tends to further centralize power, including in autocratic regimes. To use a convenient illustration, take Malaysia and Saudi Arabia, the two largest majority Muslim nations in the world. Each has now exports about $200 billion annually. Malaysia exports at $200 billion by having 12,000 individual exporting companies employing 5 million people. Saudi Arabia exports $200 billion annually, largely through one company, Saudi Aramco, which employs 50,000 people. If you look at the analogous oil boom in the 1970s, there was a paucity of development in this region, and it is not clear that this boom will produce any different results. So here, economics once again is critical to broader U.S. foreign policy aims. The U.S. certainly needs to lead in a cooperative effort to bring the remaining countries, these remaining countries into the WTO system. I also think the U.S. ought to have an AGOA-type approach, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, an AGOA-type approach to give reforming Middle East and Muslim economies duty-free access into the United States as a way of spurring economic diversification and growth, and perhaps over time a free trade agreement among various countries in these regions. The point is that, in my view, regional stability and peace, unaccompanied by economic diversification and economic growth in this region, will be entirely unsustainable. Fifth suggestion, continued leadership of the multilateral system. I agree with what Carla has said. Doha needs to conclude. If it isn't this administration, I believe it will conclude in the next administration, whoever's president. We can talk about that later. This really refers to Fred Bergston's question earlier. And it seems to me the global system has to re-embrace something we did in the 1990s, which are sectoral agreements. They're easier to do. The political cost and pain for countries is less, and they are remarkably effective in spurring growth. And last, sixth suggestion, there needs to be continued reform of global economic institutions. It is crazy that China is not in the G8, but if you look at China, India, Brazil, maybe South Africa, these are countries that ought to be in the G8. Certainly, the IMF needs a more robust and expanded role. China's role in the global economy needs to be expanded, reluctant though China is. APEC needs a new mission because it is an adjunct to a more balanced and mutually supportive series of relationships in Asia for the United States. And in part, that reinvigoration is not only to rekindle the notion of free and open trade in the Asia-Pacific region, but there are 4 issues that I think are critical both to the U.S. and to the key Asian countries in APEC, and they ought to be discussed in earnest, and that is energy, climate change, aging populations, and Pacific finance. So these 6 initiatives and many others, I believe, ought to be part of the next wave for the next administration, reflecting and reinforcing once again that U.S. trade and economic policy, that U.S. security policy are one and the same. They are intertwined, and it is inconceivable you would have one without the other. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Excellent presentation. Comments from the rest of the panel?
Yeah, just Charlene, I agree with you on what AGOA has done, and the membership of most sub-Saharan African nations in the WTO has meant great growth, in fact, in sub-Saharan Africa, which is interesting, even in the face of Chad, Sudan, Congo, Kenya, all having political and strategic problems right now. The growth continues, and it's quite striking in comparison, as you noted, to the Middle East. How do we get that done? How do you move that forward, given all the political and other problems we face from Morocco east? How would you see us moving in that direction?
I think that President Bush had an opportunity to do that earlier on in his administration and rejected the notion of doing an AGOA-type approach. I thought that was a mistake at the time. I think that Congress especially becomes more and more sympathetic to trade agreements, the extent to which the tie with security becomes increasingly apparent. As I said earlier, it was partly the rationale for why the vote on China PNTR was as strong as it was. And with respect to the Middle East, if one does what we did with respect to Africa, and that is tie preferential trade treatment in the U.S. to indicators of reform in those governments, and one can posit any one of a number of indicators, but indicators of reform, there would be enhanced sympathy, I think, on the part of Congress to move in that direction. No one has a satisfactory response to the tensions created globally from what is viewed as a schism between the Muslim world on the one hand and, if you will, the Western world on the other. And this is one means of promoting a level of economic diversification and, over time, integration that can only be of positive benefit. And I do think the case can be made to the Congress. I think Congress would be sympathetic to it, especially given the example of AGOA and the important benefits that has brought to so many poor people. When people think of Muslim countries, and particularly the Muslim Middle East, of course, Americans see oil and wealth. That is actually not the state of play, as I've indicated, in countries aligned in this very, very broad swath overall.
Charlene, let me ask you two questions. One of them big picture on the playing field that you've described, but another inevitably a much smaller playing field, the bilateral U.S.-China, but they're both related to China. What specifically would you suggest as, to go back to Fred's question, top priority for re-engaging in Asia in the next administration? One option that Fred's described so well is the possibility of pursuing a free trade area of the Asia-Pacific, which would include China. Other options might be following up on Wendy's good work on Korea FTA to go to a Japan FTA, and further down the road perhaps a U.S.-India FTA. Then there's ASEAN +3, +6. Where do we begin? Second question comes to Congress, and it's trying to deal with the concerns that we've had in the last 6-12 months about the ballooning trade deficit. 3 options are being discussed. One of them, reduce presidential discretion under Section 421 special safeguards. that you negotiated as part of China's accession, and the president seems not to have used the authority he has there. Another is either anti-dumping duties or countervailing duties against China in connection with alleged currency misalignment. It's not alleged, it is currency misalignment. And third, perhaps the IMF being utilized as a triggering mechanism. If and when the IMF finds that there officially certifies that there is such a misalignment, that this becomes a trigger for certain remedies, trade remedies that the U.S. might use.
With respect to the first series of questions, I think you could proceed in Asia on any one of a number of bases. It is tempting to suggest that the basis be the easier, not the harder, so as to build critical mass. So to the extent a U.S.-ASEAN free trade arrangement could be worked out, that provides substantial critical mass in Asia toward an APEC goal of free and open trade among the APEC regions, particularly when combined with a Korea agreement, and because Japan under those circumstances can't stand still, the beginning of negotiation with Japan. So I think the building of critical mass in this area will be very, very important. That is not to say that you can't also, within APEC, rejuvenate, revitalize the notion of free and open trade in the Asia-Pacific region. Most countries in that region want to be assured of a balanced system of alliances with the same opportunities and same constraints on the U.S., China, and Japan as on each other. That is to say, most countries in the region do not want to see U.S. disengagement, retain some suspicion of China and Japan, which retain some suspicion of the United States. All of that's fine. That's completely fine. A little bit of mutual suspicion, a little bit of mutual trust. That system, which is very delicate, needs to be maintained, in my view. And so balancing out these alliances through an APEC modality, but also through the strategic underpinning of a series of free trade agreements, ultimately over the long run, perhaps woven together, to my mind, is an absolute priority. The U.S. has fought 3 wars in Asia in 60 years, right? World War II, Korea, Vietnam. Nobody needs a 4th. With respect to the trade deficit, so here I have to blame Richard Nixon, because why not? And that is, it was Richard Nixon who, when the U.S. trade deficit reached $1 billion, equated trade deficits with unfair trade. He was the first. And that shibboleth has continued on through every administration, because it's so easy to say, through every administration, Democrat and Republican, through every presidential candidate, Democrat and Republican, ever since. We could talk about unfair trade practices, and unfair trade practices, if they are unfair, need to be dealt with. I was a big enforcement hawk. I've always been a big enforcement hawk. You make an agreement, you enforce the agreement, or don't make the agreement to begin with. But this kind of enforcement, dumping, countervails, safeguards, special safeguards, it doesn't do anything with regard to the aggregate trade imbalances because they're so great, and they're not a function of unfair trade, largely. I think, Fred, many, many years ago, you and I were testifying, well, many, many years ago for you, for me it was just yesterday, you and I were testifying, and you had done a study at that time that if you removed all of the trade barriers that existed to U.S. goods, you would have moved the trade imbalance by 10%. That was it, right? And so these issues of enforcement are critical, as I said, for the credibility of trade agreements, and they're certainly critical politically because people have to believe, and they are entitled to fair conditions of trade. But as soon as you say or imply that doing any of that will alter the aggregate trade imbalances, you will set up an expectation that will never be met because those imbalances aren't actually due largely to unfair trade. And that makes the public increasingly suspicious of trade agreements, increasingly hostile and antagonistic to action with respect to further market opening. It's the wrong metric. It has been the wrong metric since Richard Nixon started it, and it remains the wrong metric today.